Hi everyone, and I'm Huy Phung, and on behalf of the Multiolelo team, I'd like to welcome you to our second webinar on the issues of communicating language research. Before we begin, I'd like to express our thanks to the Department of Second Language Studies here at the University of Hawaii for allowing us to co-host this event on the Broadback sections. And we also would like to express our appreciation to the Student Equity Excellence Diversity Program of the University of Hawaii for funding this event. And we particularly would like to welcome and thank our guest speaker today, Dr. Cormick. Dr. Cormick is one of Australia's leading science communicators, and with over 30 years of experience working with agencies such as the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, Questacon, and federal government departments. He's the former president of the Australian Science Communicators and also an award-winning author for more than 20 books, and is widely published in research journals. And in 2014, he was awarded the Unsung Hero of Science Communication by the Australian Science Communicators. And he specializes in communicating complex science issues and has taught writing and public relations at universities in Australia and conducted communication workshops worldwide. Excuse me. And Dr. Cormick is also the author of The Science of Communicating Science, the Ultimate Guide, published in 2019. And you can also enter his name in Google and find a dedicated Wikipedia page about Dr. Cormick. Okay, now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Cormick for our second webinar series talk today.
Thank you very much, Huy, and thank you everybody for joining me today. In Australia, we tend to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, and I'm talking to you from the land of the Ngunnawal people, the Indigenous people in Australia. I see we have people from a wide variety of areas and backgrounds, so please forgive me if I start speaking very fast, or if I have trouble understanding what I'm saying. Please make a comment in the comments area to tell me to slow down a bit. But I use a lot of visuals, so that should make it a lot easier. So let me jump across. Before I do, I've got my two lap warmers here with me today. I don't know what you're like at your end, but whenever I get out of bed very early, they come straight in here and jump on my lap and be a part of the webinar. Okay, let's share. Here we are. Jump into full projection mode. There we are. Okay, so the science of communicating science, or why don't they just listen to me? So the basic premise of what I'm going to talk to you about today is really about what gets in the way of effective communication. So I've studied languages as part of communication, studied several different languages, and I know that getting the words right is only half the chore. Often there are different things that get in the way emotionally, get in the way we perceive things, that stop effective communication happening. And I'm going to talk you largely through what causes these and what can be done about it. A lot of it's based on sociology, social psychology, and psychology background work. I describe it as the challenge of communicating in a post-truth, post-trust, post-expert, post-COVID-19 world. First question for everyone. The greatest problem with communicating is, now, if you've got a bit of paper or a pen nearby or something, just have a guess, see what you think the greatest problem is. You don't need to share this one as a poll, but I want everyone to have a think how they think that sentence might end. Spend 10 seconds and write down an idea that you think it is. So what George Bernard Shaw actually said was, the greatest problem with communicating is the illusion that it has been accomplished. So let's look some more detail at that. We're going to look at 6 different things today. We're going to talk about what drives different ways we think. We're going to look at trust, how important that is for communicating, segmentation, risk communication, how values drive attitudes and value segmentation, and then framing. So let's look at the first one. What drives the different ways we think? First of all, a quick video for everybody. Okay, so the point is that in the modern world, it's no longer a level playing field. There are so many people out there trying to win your beliefs and attitudes that there's information. I talk about a post-truth, post-trust, post-expert world. So every bit of information we have, there are many players out there who are working very hard to provide you with information that you'll respond to emotionally. And that's how that video shows how easy it is to do that. Now, another question for you. If you drew these two lines on a bit of paper in front of you, what do you think they might be? I'm not going to poll this one. I'm just going to ask you to have a think about it. Have a think what you think those two lines might be. I'll spend a couple of seconds. When I do this in live venues, and I really wish I was live in Hawaii today, but we're not. People say, oh, they're two hills. They're what are they? There's the time and distance and gap. What is it? So what they actually are is, let me show you, child learning and retention and adult learning and retention. So what we know is from learning models is that children learn something, it goes up very high, and then fade is slow. But for adults, it goes up very high, fade is very fast. So what that actually means is you're going to forget most of the things I tell you today. And the more things I tell you, the more things you're going to forget. You're very good at remembering the emotion. So if someone says, oh, I saw a great documentary on the news the other night. I don't remember all the facts, but I remember how I felt. Feelings have a much stronger impact on us than facts. So I could throw lots and lots of graphs and statistics at you all afternoon, and you're going to forget most of them. So the first message for effective communication, the simpler the message, the more likely people will remember it. And the more complex it is, the more trouble people will have understanding it. Okay, this time we are going to do a poll. So I'll bring up the poll questions in a minute, but here are your options. Do you have any of these fears? Fear of spiders, snakes, heights, small spaces, open crowd spaces, fear of flying? Let me bring up our poll. I'm going to relaunch the polling. Continue. So please answer against those ones you have. And I'll put there the statistical of how many people in the general population have those. So please go ahead. This is very good how we see the poll results coming in real time here. I'll give another 5 seconds or so for a few more results. Okay, let's have a look at I'll end the poll there and let me share the results. So the biggest one is the fear of snakes amongst the audience we have today. 38%, 24% have a fear of spiders, 29% have a fear of heights, 26% have a fear of small spaces, 17% a fear of open or crowded spaces, 14% fear of flying, and 26% have other fears. So it's very common. Most of us have a phobia or a fear about something. So let's jump into the next slide. If you were to ask anybody sitting near you, or think about when you're talking about a phobia, and you ask a person, what do they most fear? And in these cases, you've given me your answers. If I was to tell you that your fear is completely illogical and counter to any factual evidence, would that make any difference to the way you think? Undoubtedly not. Telling someone that the fear of snakes is irrational won't make them less afraid of snakes. Telling someone that fear of flying isn't as dangerous as they think it is does very little, if nothing, to make them less afraid of flying. So clearly when it comes to the emotion and the facts, we are hardwired for the emotions to take over. So let's have a look at the shape of our changing world. What are we seeing in a post-COVID-19 world? This is the shape of our global environment. We have a lack of trust in public institutions. We see a lot of anti-globalization and anti-multinationalization, increased empowerment of consumers, celebrities becoming opinion leaders, a lot of public health scares. We see more environmental disasters. We see the rise of alternative beliefs and alternative truths to challenge existing beliefs and truths. Failures of government, the internet becoming an echo chamber, becoming the main media source, a rise of dogma, increased demand for scrutiny and consultation in governments, and new citizen-driven democracy. So it's a very complex environment we're working in with lots of people challenging truths and beliefs from each other. We have many perceived high risks with low known hazards, such as infant vaccinations, GMOs, water fluoridation, nanotechnology, or windmills even. But also some low risks, people perceive low risks, but actually very high known hazards, which we've seen a lot in people who are refusing to wear masks during the COVID worst times. So why is this? Well, we've become more fractured socially and ideologically in societies. And whatever beliefs we choose to adopt, we will find like-minded people to affirm those beliefs. There's no longer a scale of authority with data and scientific data near the top. We choose what to believe and we find information that supports that belief, and we will not change those positions easily. So 5 key important things to know. If you forget most everything I talk about today, these are the 5 things to remember. When information is complex, people make decisions based on their values and their beliefs. Second point, people seek affirmation of their attitudes or beliefs, no matter how fringe, and will reject any information or facts that are counter to their attitudes or beliefs. Attitudes that were not formed by logic are not influenced by logical arguments. Public concerns about contentious science or technologies are almost never about the science, and scientific information, therefore, does little to influence those concerns. And most people trust those whose values mirror their own. Okay, we'll look at these in more detail as we move through it, but those are the 5 big things to try and remember. So what's the heart of the problem? Well, the heart of the problem is actually the way we are wired psychologically. It leads us to common errors in our thinking that in turn lead us to distortions of perception, inaccurate judgments, or illogical interpretations. When we are time poor, overwhelmed with data, uncertain, driven by fear or emotion, we tend to assess information on mental shortcuts or our values, not logic. And as I said before, opinions that were not formed by logical facts are not then able to be influenced by logic or facts. So this is how an ideal world communication works. I have some information, it goes through the vibosphere, whatever, somebody gets information and they accept, they understand the idea. This is what it looks like in real life. These are things that get in the way of that. People's values, intuition, mental shortcuts, confirmation bias, motivated reasoning, backfire, they all stop that information getting through to the idea. So let's look at some of those in a little bit of detail. Intuition. It's often said by social psychologists and psychologists that our intuition is unsuited to the modern world. Now, our intuition has served us well for tens of thousands of years. It stopped us stepping out of the safe cave into the dangerous dark of the night, but is largely unsuited to the modern world because it leads to superstitions, paranormal beliefs, and pseudoscience. When we're presented with information that is complex, we tend to make emotionally based judgments driven by our values or our worldviews rather than the information presented to us. And 3 examples of this: anti-GM food beliefs align very much with having natural values. Climate change denial aligns very much with anthropocentrism. Or anti-embryonic stem cells aligns very much with having a right to life belief. And understanding how values drives our attitudes helps us explain what might at first look appear completely contradictory, but once you understand the values behind it, makes complete sense. So my father, he had very pro-development values. He always was talking about, we need to build more, we need to grow the economy. And that leads you to saying, hey, respect the science on GM foods, but the science on climate change? Nah, I don't think so. That's a bit dubious. However, on the other hand, you have more pro-environment values that can lead you to saying, hey, respect the science on climate change, but the science on GM foods? That's dubious. So how can one science be right and one science be wrong? It's simply because the framing of our belief system or our worldview pushes it in those directions. Backfire. This is interesting. When people are shown information proving that their beliefs are wrong, they actually become more entrenched in their original beliefs. And you can look at that in politics, you can look at that in sport, you can look at whether you're an Android or Macintosh phone, whatever. If you show someone what their belief doesn't stand up to data and information, they will actually become more entrenched in that belief. And highly intelligent people tend to suffer backfire more than less intelligent people do, which makes us immune to any facts that are counter to our strongly held beliefs. Confirmation bias is something we see all the time around us. When presented with both sides of an argument, people tend to focus only on the arguments that support their existing point of view, and they become more entrenched in that view and won't accept the merits of any other viewpoints. Amplification: the more people with opposing points of view talk about a topic, the less likely they'll agree on any issue or even see it in the same way, which is a challenge because in many TV debates in the media, you get 2 people with different points of view on and ask them to talk about it. Now, if there was any vain hope that they might come to an agreement, even in a public forum, what it really does is actually entrench those different points of view from them. So that oppositional debate and argument does very little to help us come up with a consensus point of view. So even our brain's wiring works against us. So neuroscience shows us how the makeup of the brain is here. Here's a cross-section of your average brain. Thalamus is the brain's post office, where all the information comes into. Right next to it, you have the amygdala. Now, the amygdala right here is what we call the danger part of the brain. And right up the front here, you have the prefrontal cortex, where all the really high-level thinking happens. So what this means is that the danger emotional part of our brain sits right next to the post office, and the higher order thinking and logic sits a long way away from the post office. So as David Ropek, who's written a very good paper on this, has said, both the physical architecture and biochemistry of the brain ensure that emotion and instinct have the upper hand over reason and rationality. Before you know you're afraid of something, you are afraid. The inescapable truth is that when it comes to risk, we are hardwired to feel first and think second. Now, some of you might be familiar with Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Prize winning economist book, fast thinking and slow thinking. So he talks about using mental shortcuts is fast thinking. We use very quick mental shortcuts and stereotypes to think. Fast thinking is prone to a lot of errors, but it uses a lot of less energy. And our brain's basically pretty lazy. It doesn't like using a lot of energy because our brain uses a lot of energy. Slow thinking, very hard work, uses more analytical and critical thinking, still prone to some errors by limited information, but our brains have a preference for the fast thinking. He also points out in his book that we can easily spot biases in other people's thinking, but rarely spot them in our own. So one of the core problems with science-based communication is that the public and scientists' opinions are often very far apart on different issues. Science is actually driven largely by facts, and on the other side, we have emotions, and they can be over-perceiving or under-perceiving difference, but a huge gap between them. I describe them as, the scientific term is risk equals probability by impact. Public view of risk, risk equals OMG by WTF. Here's an example from a study from the USA. It shows the difference in different thinking. So a question asked of scientists and the same question asked of the general public. Scientists were asked, is it safe to eat genetically modified foods? 88% of scientists said yes, but only 37% of adults said yes. Is climate change mostly due to human activity? 87% of scientists said yes, but only 50% of the public said yes. Have humans evolved over time? 98% of scientists said yes, only 65% of the public said yes. Do you favour more offshore drilling? 52% of scientists said yes, only 32% of the public. Should childhood vaccines such as measles, mumps and rubella be required? 86% of scientists said yes, but only 68% of the public said yes. So clearly there's a gap between information and fact-based and others. So let's test some of the ways of your thinking, fast thinking, slow thinking. Here's a poll, 4 questions. 1, do you consider yourself an above average driver? 2, have you ever eaten a meal at a restaurant, even if the food was not great? 3, do you use a mobile data after you've hit your plan's limit? And 4, do you pay the minimum or the full amount on your credit card bills? So let me jump into the poll. So click those yes or no answers. Let me launch the poll, just a minute. Okay. Please answer those questions. Some very interesting answers coming in. Okay, I'll end the polling there and share the results with you. So I'm going to stretch that down. And this is really interesting because if we look at poll question 1, I can pretty well predict that was almost all men who said yes, and a lot more of the women said no. Question 2 aligns very much with the way the general public answer. Question 3 is a turnaround. Usually we get those exactly the opposite. More people willing to use their phone and paying off your minimum full amount. You're a really good financially astute group out here, because normally you're about 50-50. Okay, let me talk you through what those questions show. What's that? If you consider yourself an above average driver, which about 80% of males do, that's an example of the overconfidence bias. Because actually 90% of people worldwide consider themselves above average drivers, which can't be true because average would mean 50%. In business, overconfident CEOs overestimate revenue from acquisitions, and more than 70% of cases, acquisitions fail. So that one's called the overconfidence bias. Another bias, let me jump forward one. If you've eaten a meal at a restaurant, even if it was not great, that's called the sunk cost bias. It makes it hard to adapt to change. The more we invest in something, the harder it is to abandon. So, for example, an organisation that's invested a lot of time and money in an inefficient technology system, I think we've all seen that, is less likely to try and find a better solution. If something you paid for, you're much more likely to hang on to it as something worthwhile. If you use your mobile data after you've hit the plan's limit, that's an example of the present bias. We tend to overvalue immediate rewards over long-term ones. And the general sociological experiment they do for that is to ask people, would you like me to give you $100 now or $200 in 3 weeks? And the majority of people say $100 now because we overvalue the immediate. And do you pay the minimum or full amount in your credit card bills? If you said the minimum, it's we rely heavily on first impressions or first offers and view the minimum due as a baseline or anchor when paying bills. Now, I should point out that advertising companies, big corporations, spend a lot of money employing psychologists and social psychologists to know how we think and to manipulate us into better ways of getting money off us and better getting us to buy things we don't always need. And an example is sometimes that in credit card payment. But you are very impressive as a group. You're more likely to pay off your full credit cards. Okay, another poll exercise for you. I have a bat and a ball. They cost $1.10. If the ball costs $1 more, if the bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Is it 10 cents, 15 cents, or 5 cents? Please go ahead and vote. Okay, a couple more seconds and I'll close the poll. There we go. End polling, share the results. So 69%, 70% of you, 7 out of 10 of you said it was 10 cents. So 7 out of 10 you got it wrong. It's not 10 cents. 10 people in the room got it right, which is 5 cents. And the other 3 have to go and do a bit more mathematics. And let me explain why that is. So if a bat costs $1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? 5 cents. $1 more is $1.05. And our brain, for most of us, tells us, no, it's $1, it's $1, it's $1, because we're relying on that fast bit of our brain. That fast thinking looks at it, and our brain fools us into thinking that's the right answer. Then we use the frontal part of our brain and really analyze it. We think, oh no, hang on. The front bit of my brain was tricking me. The front bit of my brain made a lazy attempt to try and get the right answer, didn't get it right. $1.05 is $1 more than 5 cents. Okay, let's talk about trust, since trust in the modern world is vital to effective communication. Trust these days can be built on competence and ethics. So this is a study I look at a lot. It's called the Edelman Trust Barometer, and it's really good. They do worldwide studies of trust from different countries and aggregate the data, and it's a very good looking at trends that are happening. So what we found is in the post-COVID world, trust in global leaders has plummeted in most countries with a few changes. The general feeling was, I do not have confidence that our current leaders will be able to successfully address our country's challenges. So who do people trust? Scientists, 80%. People in my community, people like me, 70%. Citizens of my country, 65%. So the big winners are people like me. CEOs, 50%. Journalists, 50%. Religious leaders have dropped a lot, 46%. Government leaders plummeted. The very wealthy, very low trust, only 36%. Even social media, which traditionally used to outrank general media in terms of use, we've seen a lot of plummeting. So search engines from 2019 to 2021 The trust has gone from 65% down to 56. Even traditional media, mainstream media, it's gone from 65 down to 53. Owned media, 59 to 41, and social media, 43 down to 35. So huge drops in trust from the places we get trust from, because people have been given so many contradictory messages from different sources, and not knowing who to trust has become very complex. This is a really interesting graph. Just let me spend a bit of time explaining it. So what they've done is they've broken up countries of the world into trust levels by whether they have high trust, middle trust, or low trust in their governments. Now, interestingly, see, from 2020 to 2021, China has, for the first time in many years, plummeted from 82% trust down to 72. USA is in the bottom levels of trust near Australia, 47% to 48%, not much movement. But interesting, have a look at the countries who have high trust: China, India, Indonesia, Thailand, United Arab Emirates, Mexico, Singapore, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia. Not what you would call countries in the great democratic tradition, and yet they have high levels of trust. And down the bottom, countries who generally call general democracies, cut out Russia, UK, Japan, South Africa, Spain, Ireland, France, Germany, USA, Australia, Italy, Argentina, very low levels of trust. There's another graph that is probably more important, this one. They divide the population up into two groups, who they call the informed public and the mass population. And the informed public, on this column, make up about 15% of the population. They're people who read the media a lot, have a high education, they share news back and forth with each other. The mass population, less so. And you can see in the USA, the informed public sit in the high trust group, but the mass public sit way down in the low trust group. So there are huge differences between what you might call the information elites and mass publics in how they view things and who they trust. Even turnarounds from some groups, as we've seen here. You can see over here on the side, it shows how that's tracked over time from 2012 up to 2021. There's been a growth of fear of fake news. 7 out of 10% globally worry about fake information or fake news being used as a weapon, weaponized fake news. And we see lots of examples around the world where that has been used, that has happened. Perhaps more disconcerting for anyone who works in the media is that 50% of the population have now become disengaged. That means they consume news less than once a week. So 50% of the population don't read or look at news once a week or less. 25% of the population consume news roughly once about a week or a little bit more. Then 25% are those we call the amplifiers. They consume news about weekly, and they often share the content several times a month or more. So a lot of mainstream media organisations now know that there are many people in society who don't look at the mainstream media, don't listen to radio or TV. They use social media to give them their news. So friends and online friends will post something if it's of interest to them. But we also know the online algorithms will bias what you're being seen to certain your beliefs, attitudes, to the way that if you have a penchant for a certain belief, you'll be biased towards getting that type of news. Let's talk about segmentation. Now, segmentation is a marketing term, but a very useful one for understanding, communicating with different parts of the public. So basically, when you look at a huge population of people, you break them up into, how do you make sense of the diversity of the people that exist in the world? In 100 people in a room, there are 100 different ideas, 100 different beliefs, 100 different personality types. Yet many of those are similar to each other. We can cluster those into similar groups. That's basically what segmentation is, finding similar groups. Now we can break them up by ages, gender, education, employment, political affiliation, income, postcode. So 67 individuals out there taking part in the seminar today. We could break you up by gender. We could break you up by age. We could break you up by countries of origin. We could break you up by using things like the Myers-Briggs personality test that some of you may have done over time. Show difference based on Jungian psychology, the 16 different personality types. We could break you up by attitudes to science. We could break you up by attitudes to climate change. Here's one, a study they call Global Warming 6 Americas. 13% of the population, they say alarmed, 26% concerned, 29% cautious, 6% disengaged, 15% doubtful, 10% dismissive, their segments. Pardon me, I'll sneeze. Pardon me. So cultural cognition worldviews. Let me just spend a moment to explain this. What we have here on the vertical axis, whether you are hierarchical or whether you are egalitarian. And from left to right, whether you're an individual, whether you're a communitarian. Now we know that the USA and Western society tend to push towards individualism. Many Asian countries push towards communitarianism. Society is important. People have a hierarchical view of the world. Who's important, who's the boss. We have people have a flat view of the world. Now, where you sit on that chart defines the way you think about different things, because that defines your worldview. So hierarchical communitarians will say legalizing marijuana is very bad, gays in the military is bad, but yes, we need to be stronger on anti-terrorism. However, if you're strong individualism egalitarian, you'll say legalizing marijuana is fine, gays in the military is good, and anti-terrorism, more money on that is a bad thing. If you're a hierarchical individual, climate change, we should pay more attention. Nuclear power is good, immigration's bad, guns are good, gun control bad. But if you're a communitarian egalitarian, you say climate change is a big problem, nuclear power is a problem, immigration is good, guns are bad, and gun control is good. So again, your worldview, where you view the world, will change the way your attitudes and beliefs are shaped. Now, in terms of communication, we can use this to effect. So we looked at people's ability to act on sustained climate change. So willingness to act on the vertical, ability to act on the horizontal, with a concerned active at the top, 36%, interested but unwilling, unsure but not unconcerned, and the confident disbelievers. Now that shows how we need to communicate with them. So the concerned active at the top, they're most likely to adopt sustainable behaviours. They just need to be shown ways to get more buy-in. If you're interested but unwilling, you tend to be paralysed by conflicting messages and barriers, easy to do nothing. They need more evidence of what's clear indications of what to do. If you're unsure but not unconcerned, you tend to demonstrate a low level of behaviour change. You need education and intervention needed. And the confident disbelievers tend to be young male, only one of those strong demographic segment, confident in their own future and the future and ability to overcome any problems. They actually need coercion or incentives to change a position. Okay, revision time. We talked about adult learning fade. So this is for yourself. I want you to spend 30 seconds and jot down some of the key things you've learned to date, because as I said before, left to your own devices, you'll forget most things I've told you today. But if you reinforce them as we go, you've got a much better chance of remembering them. So spend 30 seconds and jot down some of the key things you've learned so far. Okay, let's move along. Risk communication, which is a whole type of communication of itself. 5 quick risk communication points. Let me distill all the thousands and thousands of pages of studies and analysis on risk communication into 5 key points. First of all, managing risk perceptions is not about explaining the data, it's about reducing the outrage. Secondly, equity and control issues underlie most risk controversies. So think of any risk controversy you want to think about, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's environmental catastrophe, whether it's a health problem in your own country, and see how these apply to it. Risk communication is easier when emotions are acknowledged and legitimized. So you don't tell people their fears are irrational or unreasonable, such as your fears of spiders, snakes, heights, flying, etc. You must acknowledge and legitimize people's fears. Risk decisions are better when the public shares the power. And the big one, which I think summarized it mostly from Dr. Vince Crivello, he says, people don't care what you know, They want to know that you care. So whenever you're confronted with a risk situation, such as I'm trying to talk you and change your mind about your fear of snakes, spiders, flying, whatever, you don't care about the data I have on that. You want to know that I care about your feelings. So you've got to address people's feelings and legitimize those before you even have a hope of communicating data. So clearly risk perception is about more than actual hazard. So we know about perceived risk versus scientific reality. Perceived risk of flying is very high. The actual risk is much lower. However, perceived risk of driving is quite low and the actual risk is very high. Here's a very interesting study that's done by Susanna Hertrich called Reality Checking Device. It looks at actual risk versus perceived risk. So airplane crashes, perceived risk huge, actual risk tiny. Mobile phones, huge, tiny. Terrorist attacks, huge fear of terrorist attacks, actual risk tiny. We can run across gun crimes, bird flu, stock market crash. Then we get to the other side where people have, there's a big actual risk, but people perceive a lower risk. Heat wave risks, huge, perceived risk very small. Credit card copying, perceived risk smaller than the actual. Road traffic accidents, again, cancer or cardiovascular disease. So it swings both ways. So when people are stressed, their perceptions and decisions are influenced by a wide range of factors. We talked about when you're in a stress situation, you go straight to your mental shortcuts, your emotions, and technical facts are probably the least important to somebody's mind. That's what they're least interested in seeing. So trust factors in the first situation, listening, caring, and empathy are assessed in the first 30 seconds. And you pass or fail on that test. Dedication, commitment, honesty, openness, competence, expertise, they're all much, much lower concerns when trying to effectively communicate with somebody. And factors of risk are driven by some things. So low risk is seen to be voluntary, high risk, involuntary, common versus rare, not fatal versus fatal. How people perceive something will affect the way they perceive it to be a low risk or a high risk. And risks and benefits are different. Risk can be really vague, benefits must be specific. Risks have risen in society, but benefits need real credible evidence. Risks are often perceived to be higher than actuality. Benefits have more impact when personal or close to individual. Risks are accepted without acknowledgement of benefits, but benefits must acknowledge risks. And risks are increased by long-term effect, global impact, or being irreversible, and benefits are increased by personal impact. So even risks and benefits aren't measuring the same thing. Okay, case study. Risk communication in action, short video. So dihydrogen monoxide, pretty scary substance. We're running through another video very quickly. That next one talks about dihydrogen monoxide. So it shows that you make it sound scary. For people's minds, it is scary. Just say the chemical name, it sounds scary. So as we talk about, emotion overcomes reason, rationality. So people say, yep, that sounds scary, and lots of other people signed it. I'd better get on board and sign as well. So where do these different attitudes we have come from? Attitudes are driven by our values or our life beliefs. Let's have a quick look at how that works. Values are the Rosetta Stone for understanding risk communications. To understand someone's values, you know how to talk to them, what they'll accept and what they'll reject. Now, This will take a while to talk through, and we're getting towards the end, so I'm not going to run you through this in great detail, but largely we looked at 2 questions of 7 different questions. We asked people, does science take a big part in your lives? And we broke it down across 10 on a scale, because people don't say yes or no. It's a little bit of yes, big bit of yes, a little bit of no, yes, no. Boil it all down. What we've got is the top third are in the top here, 81%, the top third, middle third, bottom third. So only 2% were in the group that were likely to disagree with that. Jump down the bottom, science technology create more problem than it solves. 54% are in the slightly disagree, 14% in the agree. I'm going to jump to the next one because I'm going to summarize this all up. People's attitudes towards the planet around us went through. So lots of questions, lots of data. What we ended up getting was 4 key segments of the population by values. First of all, we'll use these backwards by numbers. Science fans. They were mostly male. They had a high support for science and technology. And the one value statement that most described them was, everyone should take an interest in science. The next group we call the cautiously keen. They believe the benefit of science outweighed the risks, but children should be protected from all risks, was the one value that most summarised them. Then they had the risk averse, high awareness, but high risk concerns. The one value that most summarised them was science and technology can be dangerous and risky. Finally, concerns, low awareness and high concerns. Very conservative. The one value that most summarised them was the pace of technological change is too fast. Now, we're going to run a poll, and I want you to tell me which of those you most belong to. Some people have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but which one of those 4 most captures you? Which segment do you most belong to? Science fans, cautiously keen, risk averse, or concerned? Let's see. Okay, another couple of seconds. Okay, I'll end the polling, share the results. Interesting to see, most of you are cautiously keen, about 53%. The science fans make up 30%. Now, if I'm giving this talk at a science-based institution or a research institution, I get about 80% of people saying they're science fans, which represents often what's happening in science-led institutions. What you've got here represents a much broader cross-section of most tertiary institutions. Now, let me show you some important things about that, about the learning we've got there. We discovered a couple of things. First of all, we discovered all those questions asked. I actually only need to ask 5 questions to poll people's understandings. They were, new technologies excite me more than concern me. Science and technology create more problems than they solve. People should not tamper with nature. Technological change happens too fast for me to keep up with, and we depend too much on science and not enough on faith. How you answer those 5 questions is enough to let me put you in a rough segment. We also know that the gap between segments 1, 2, 3, and 4 is sometimes very close, sometimes very large away. Sometimes segment 2 and 3 sit almost in the same spot. Sometimes segment 2 and 3 sit further away. But the big one for the science fans, the fanboys and fangirls, number 4, big important finding, was that segment 4 were outliers. They're further from the average point of the public than any other segment, which means not only do they and the other segments have small chance of understanding them, the segment 4 has small chance of understanding the other segments as well. And often when science policy is driven by the science wonks in session 4, it makes for a big gap between the broader public and the science elites. Okay, quick 30 seconds, revision time. Another chance to write down a few key learnings. Reinforce those things into your brain there so they don't fade away tomorrow morning. Write down some key learnings, then we're going to whiz through the last few slides. All right, last one, framing. Talk about framing. Framing, very important to understand how to frame different communication, get a different answer. Frames can impact the way people think about a topic. People tend to be more open-minded about information presented in a way that appears to be consistent with their values. Contentious issues have many different interest groups competing to have their own preferred frame as the dominant one. Here's an example. A case study in 2011 showed how metaphors influence or alter people's perceptions. In the study, participants were presented with brief passages about crime in a hypothetical city called Addison. For half of the participants, a few words were altered so that the passages said that crime was a beast preying on the city of Addison. For the other half, crime was described as a virus infecting the city. Now, which metaphor was used affected the way people thought about it. So those who were told the beast preying on the city metaphor are actually more likely to believe that crime should be dealt with by using punitive measures, more policing and more punishments. Whereas those who were told that crime was a virus infecting the city were more likely to support reform and reformative measures. So very much framing can affect the way you think about things. Framing is not hyping, I should point out. And there has been a big problem in the media in recent years. The word positive uses the words of hyping of all kinds of political messages and scientific and economic messages hyping. Framing is a bit different. Framing is how you don't spin something, but how you frame it to align the message of someone's values. I'm going to jump through this case study because it's quite long and complex. We don't need all that detail. Rather, we're going to come to how to frame a story to align with audience mindset. So I went through a big case study there about GM foods, but basically there are two frames competing out there for the general public. One frame says GM crops are unnatural. One frame says GM can help crops adapt to a changing climate. Now, they're both a little bit right and they're both a little bit wrong in their own ways, but people will turn to the message that aligns with their values. And people divide. If I ask you which one you believe in, you'll give me an answer that largely aligns with your worldview. As I said before, your worldview tends to govern the way you view things, and your worldview gives you an emotional frame to accept or dismiss a message. I'll give you one final point, very useful language thing here called deflection. Deflection is very helpful when you're communicating in a difficult situation. I'll give you examples how you deflect a message. So undeflected, using the word you're not really worried about your health. You're afraid your property prices might be affected. So the case study here was land that had been contaminated, and the public were coming together to discuss their concerns over it. And this is how the responses could vote. So undeflected, completely undeflected, to tell someone you're not worried about your health, you're afraid property values might be affected. Probably get a lot of pushback on that one. To deflect a little bit, use the word I was in a situation like this when I lived near an industrial park. What worried me even more than the health effects was the possibility that my property values might be affected. Using yourself, deflecting a little bit, more likely to be accepted message. More deflected, one of your neighbours was talking with me last week about a situation, and the thing that worried him the most was the possibility of an effect on his property values. So moving away from the person to me to they. Still more deflected, some people in a situation like this will probably be worried about their property values. And the most deflected, it's possible there could be some concern about property values here. So you move it away from the person, the further you move it away, the more deflected it is, the more people will take it less as an accusation or threat against themselves and willing to accept the communication that therefore follows. And with that, you've got one final revision time, which you can have a think about as an activity. And on the last actually thing, I want you to also write down not just the things you've learned, but what are the key things you learned today that might lead you to do things differently as a result in your own work or communications. So not just what you've learned, but how you might apply that. So have a couple of moments to write that down, to reinforce those in your brain. And with that, mahalo, and we have time for questions. And there's my book. Most of the things I talked about today are all in my book, Science of Communicating Science. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Cormick, for a very informative presentation.